We have a hard reading today, but we can do it if for no other reason than we're going to do it together and because we have a God who abides with us. I would invite you to bring your soul and your heart and your whole being to this story today. I'll try to do the same. This is from 2 Samuel 13, verses 1 through 11 from the New Living Translation. Now David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar. And Amnon, her half-brother, fell desperately in love with her. Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. She was a virgin, and Amnon thought he could never have her. But Amnon had a very crafty friend, his cousin Jonadab. He was the son of David's brother Shimea. One day Jonadab said to Amnon, "What's the trouble? Why should the son of a king look so dejected morning after morning?" So Amnon told him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Well," Jonadab said, "I'll tell you what to do. Go back to bed and pretend you're ill, and when your father comes to see you, ask him to let Tamar come and prepare some food for you. Tell him you'll feel better if she prepares it as you watch and feeds you with her own hands." So Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. And when the king came to see him, Amnon asked him, "Please let my sister Tamar come and cook my favorite dish as I watch. Then I can eat it from her own hands." So David agreed and sent Tamar to Amnon's house to prepare some food for him. When Tamar arrived at Amnon's house, she went to the place where he was lying down so he could watch her mix some dough. Then she baked his favorite dish for him. But when she set the serving tray before him, he refused to eat. "Everyone get out of here," Amnon told his servants. So they all left. Then he said to Tamar, "Now bring the food into my bedroom and feed it to me here." So Tamar took his favorite dish to him. But as she was feeding him, he grabbed her and demanded, "Come to bed with me, my darling sister." "No, my brother," she cried. "Don't be foolish. Don't do this to me. Such wicked things are not done in Israel. Where could I go in my shame? And you would be called one of the greatest fools in Israel. Please, just speak to the king about it, and he will let you marry me." But Amnon would not listen to her. And since he was stronger than she was, he raped her. Then suddenly Amnon's love turned to hate. He hated her even more than he had loved her. "Get out of here," he snarled at her. "No, no," Tamar cried. "Sending me away now is worse than what you've already done to me." But Amnon would not listen to her. He shouted for his servant and demanded, "Throw this woman out and lock the door behind her." So the servant put her out and locked the door behind her. She was wearing a long, beautiful robe, as was the custom in those days for the king's virgin daughters. But now Tamar tore her robe and put ashes on her head, and then, with her face in her hands, she went away crying. May God bless a difficult reading from His Word. I would rather not preach on this story today. I'd rather bring you a word about faith or hope or love. I'd rather bring a word about our highest aspirations, not our most vile impulses. I'd rather bring a word that sends our minds soaring to the heavens, not probing the bedroom of some ancient palace. But I am preaching on this today and feel compelled to do so because God doesn't seem to care a whole lot about what I'm comfortable with. Honestly, I wish this story was not in the Bible. Scholars call this story, and others like it, texts of terror. Perhaps that's the most difficult part of it, is this isn't the only story in the Bible like this. If you read the whole thing, raw, painful, dramatic, troubling stories of sexual abuse. Don't go reading in Genesis 16 if you don't want to hear stories like this. Abraham and Sarah and their slave Hagar, who eventually has to flee out into the wilderness. But by the way, do you know that Hagar, Egyptian slave Hagar, abused Hagar, is the first person in the Bible to give God a name? Do you know that? And Hagar gives God the name God sees. Whew. God sees. If you don't want to hear about this sort of stuff, don't go reading in Genesis 18 about the shameful inhospitality and attempted gang rape in Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Lot offers his daughters to the mad crowd. Don't go reading in Judges 19 about a similar story involving a Levite's concubine. And don't read 2 Samuel 11, just 2 chapters before what we just read, when King David is in the palace looking over at Bathsheba and he summons her into his chamber. Before that story is over, she is violated and Uriah, her husband, is dead. I wish these texts of terror were not in the Bible, but they are. Truth be told, I wish these stories weren't in our newspapers either, but they are. Can I offer you some cold, hard facts this morning? In this country, 1 in 5 women will be raped at some point in their lives. 1 in 5. Statistics say 1 in every 71 men will too. By the way, I'm going to talk a lot about men and women today, but just from the beginning, these things do happen to men too. One of the things we struggle with in these statistics is these are classically underreported crimes. 1 in 71 men, but who really knows? In this country, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will experience some sort of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. According to a recent Democrat Gazette article from October 2nd, rape is on the increase on college campuses all around the state of Arkansas. An incredibly troubling article that was in the news just a couple of weeks ago. And lest we think the problem is just secularism, people who, don't love God or anything like that, reading these statistics in the light of stained glass windows doesn't make them look much better. Just this summer, hear me, just this summer, Southwestern Seminary, a Southern Baptist school in Fort Worth, was embroiled in a sexual abuse and cover-up controversy. And the president was fired, though big donors suggested they were going to pull their funds unless he was rehired. They did eventually dismiss him. But I heard this week he was rehired to teach ethics in a different institution. Willow Creek Church, a megachurch, non-denominational church in the suburbs of Chicago, dismissed their famous pastor because of an abusive sexual relationship between him and the church secretary, his personal secretary, that had gone on for years. And the Catholic diocese in Pennsylvania was exposed in a sexual abuse cover-up scheme involving some 300 priests. Hear me, people. Hear me. Maybe the Bible tells these stories because the Bible is as real and raw as life is, and since it's happening in the world, the Bible tells us it's happening. The Bible tends to tell stories that are true. Not true because they happened once upon a time, but true because they happen all the time. And yet, while sex is on every news report, headline, and scandal around us today, it seems, and it's pervasive in our Holy Scriptures, we as a church have largely been silent about it because it makes us uncomfortable. And yet, people are scarred for life because we've said nothing about sex other than to say don't and can't and shouldn't. That's all I heard growing up. And most of the sermons I heard on sex were through the prism of purity, which is saturated with shame, if you think about it. It's not through the lens of love, where it's saturated with redemption for all people. We as a church have lost the idea that sex is a wondrous gift from God to be celebrated and affirmed. But in our prohibitive posture, we've allowed some forms of sexual repression to be as dangerous as some forms of sexual expression. We are not angels, brothers and sisters. Sex is a part of our lives. It's part of the stuff of our life, part and parcel. But as we all know, any of God's wondrous and good gifts can be abused and warped. We are not angels, but we're not animals either. Gifts can easily and quickly become weapons. And so the story goes. Amnon was one of King David's sons, making him something of a prince in Israel. He had a beautiful half-sister whose name was Tamar, and the text says he loved her. He loved her. But he was frustrated because he couldn't figure out a way to have her. In fact, in the original language in Hebrew, it says, it was hard in Amnon's eyes to see how he could have her. The story starts with Amnon's eyes. It was hard in his eyes. Remember that. We're going to come back to the eyes. But Amnon had a friend. Did you hear that? The text says Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. And Jonadab was a shrewd man, it says in the original text. If that word sounds familiar to you, it should. It's the same word used of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, shrewd. Who said to Amnon, "You're the prince of Israel, why are you so sad?" And Jonadab lived up to the descriptor, and he hatched a plan whereby Amnon would pretend to be sick, and when Tamar came to take care of him, he would have her. His demons would prey on her angels. And Amnon acted according to the plan, just so by the letter. When Tamar came to attend to him in his sickness, he seized her and said, "No, my brother." Her first word in this story is no. The first word she utters is no. Don't do this disgraceful thing. But because he was stronger than her, he violated her and raped her. Then afterwards, the text says Amnon hated Tamar, and his hatred for her was greater than the love he had for her beforehand. Because the truth of the matter is, he did not love her, ever. And he sent her away, to which she said again to him, "No, no, this is wrong. Sending me away is worse than what you've already done to me. Violation leads to violation." But he sent her away anyway. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her robe and put her head in her hands and went away crying as she left. Of course, there are so many directions this text could send us. We could go so many directions. And over the course of time, we probably should. We could talk about how this story in chapter 13 echoes chapter 11 in so many ways. How Amnon is behaving in ways that mirror his father, King David. The apple in this regard did not fall far from the tree. We could talk about how so many young men treat women the way they have seen their fathers treat other women. And we could talk about a toxic masculinity today that teaches males that manhood is about might and power and leadership, which also means being female is about weakness and vulnerability and submission. And if this is the way we think about it, brothers and sisters, then it's not just women who need to be liberated in our culture. I am the father of 2 sons. I believe the Me Too movement in our world today has as much to say about their well-being as it does if I had 2 daughters. We all need to be liberated as a culture in this way. We could talk about how we simply can't say that what happens in the bedroom is none of our business. Just so I upset everyone in the room today, this is a sentiment that I feel with some of my more progressive and liberal friends. It's the bedroom. Who cares what happens in the bedroom? I feel that sentiment and it concerns me. Because what happens in the bedroom does not stay in the bedroom. It fractures families and countries. And what we do with our sex life is an expression of the whole of our lives. It's part and parcel to the thing. It matters. We could talk about how this whole story took place in a palace. The whole thing takes place in a palace amidst powerful men. When someone is accused, or when someone is accustomed to people simply doing what they want, they expect oftentimes similar behaviors in the bedroom. And people are often dehumanized in the process, just cogs in the wheel of power. This seems to be the case with power of any sort, by the way, not just political power, religious power too. For some powerful men, power is the only language they can understand. And when women are subordinated to men in any way, it makes it all the easier to abuse them in this way. When women are subordinated to men in any way, it makes it easier to abuse them in this way. Or we could talk about the further victimization of Tamar. We stopped reading today in verse 19 because you have to stop somewhere. Verse 20, Absalom, her full brother, Absalom's in her corner. He supports her because he doesn't like Amnon. They're rivals to the throne of David, both sons of David, you see. But Absalom says to Tamar, shh, don't say anything. The story, this secret is Tamar's to bear. Nobody else wants to hear it. And the victim in the story is further victimized because the people who bear the responsibility of the truth all too often don't want it told. And so the pain, the memory, the injustice of the thing is internalized to keep the peace in the palace. But brothers and sisters, keeping the peace is a world away from making peace. And oftentimes the difference between keeping the peace and making the peace is telling the truth in our souls, yearning for the truth. We could discuss all the family language in this text. Did you hear it? It didn't so much come up in the translation I read today. In some of the others, family language saturates this text. We read 19 verses. I counted family language 13 times. But it all changes with the rape. Before that deed is done, Amnon is saying, my sister, my sister, my sister Tamar, my sister, my brother, my sister. But afterwards, Amnon says, throw this woman out. The family language comes to a screeching halt. Of course, some people would say, well, that's what they are. This is a family, sideshow here, and it is. But might I suggest to you today that there's something else at play here? Do you know, by the way, that most people who are victims of sexual abuse are victims to someone they knew and oftentimes knew well beforehand? In my mind, I thought this stuff happened amongst strangers. But more times than not, it happens with people you know well. People who know you well. I suggest to you today that this text is reminding us all that we are brothers and sisters to each other. That there are family bonds at work here. In my experience, most of the guy talk and the locker room banter I have heard come from men who would have been most offended if someone would have said the same thing about their mother or wife or daughter or sister, which is the height of hypocrisy. Every woman is someone's sister and mother and daughter, and in a way, every woman is your sister and every man is your brother. Love turns that woman into my sister, but lust turns my sister into that woman. And one of God's sons hurts one of God's daughters, and there's trouble in the royal palace. Yes, this story goes in so many directions. But the problem with all the options I just stated is they go chasing after the men. The one who's often ignored is the one who's often ignored. Tamar. Surely, she deserves to be heard. Her first word before this act was no. And her first word after the act was no. And yet, if you read the text carefully at the end of the story, she's the one putting ashes on her head, and she's the one tearing her garments. Why? Why? In your souls, why? Why is Amnon's sin Tamar's shame? And why is Tamar told to be quiet about it? The one who had every right and every reason to be screaming and yelling is told to be quiet, even by the brother who's standing in her corner. Shh. And at the end of the story, Tamar seems to bear the burden of the deed, not the one who did it. Tamar is the desolate one at the end. Tamar is alone at the end. Amnon is active and talking. Absalom is active and talking. David is active and talking. But Tamar is in the shadows. And I'm not sure she's ever left. Because the focus of men's sins remains on how they impact the men. Tamar's tears still fall on many a pillow in Little Rock. And her pain is present in pews, I dare say, in every church in Central Arkansas that's worshiping today. Tamar's silence is not just found in that palace so long ago, but it's found all around us today. I will say to you today, I had a lot of reticence about even reading a text of terror. I know how it feels. My hope was that just naming the thing, saying that it happens, might carry some sort of release for the people to whom it has happened. God is still the God who sees. Hagar wasn't wrong. And I wanted to talk about it today so there are fewer texts of terror in the morning paper every day. This story follows the men because most every story follows the men. But dare I suggest to you today that the God revealed to us in Jesus Christ sat with Tamar in her ashes after this deed was done. And in this way, brothers and sisters, people who believe that the Me Too movement is a fad of the moment neither know their history books very well nor their Bibles, because this stuff has been going on a long time. Ironically, this story begins by saying Amnon had a friend. I wonder if Tamar ever found one. Amnon has a friend. Does Tamar? Would Tamar find a friend at Second Baptist Church? Brothers and sisters, this is the time. This is the time for the church to stand up and speak out about matters of sex. Part of being the church is speaking to the issues of our time because they're our time. If we don't speak about the issues of our time, whose time are we going to talk about? This is the time. This is the time for the church to recover the goodness of sex as a gift from God, as an expression of love and intimacy, and as such, you can hardly think of a better one. Throughout church history, the saints have said that there's something in the beautiful act of sex that speaks to an expression of God's love, God's passionate and intimate love for all people. Throughout the ages, the church has said sex is about more than animalistic impulses, and it's about more than the biological propagation of the species, but it's a sacred expression of God's love. And where sex builds up and brings together and makes whole and heals, it is to be celebrated, and the church should be the DJ at that party. Maybe we should read the Song of Solomon a little more often to remind us of that. But, where sex is an expression of power and not love, it is not of God. Where sex is a matter of transaction, where one person gets what they want or both people get what they want, but there is no relationship, they just go their merry way. There is no abiding love, there is no commitment or covenant that's still there after that deed is done. That is not of God. It cheapens it. Where sex treats people as objects and not acting subjects, it is not of God. Did you know that the internet tells me, they've done research on this, so I'm sure it's true. People who are pathologically violent, terrorists, the most vile folks we can imagine, nearly every time those people are caught and really investigated, they have pornography in their lives, on their computers, in their homes. Every time. What is the link there? I think it's because when we live behind fantasies, we create faux worlds that we can't tell the difference between real and fake. And when we objectify people with our eyes, we are a short step from objectifying them in every other way. We can't see their humanity anymore. And the problem's not with their humanity. The problem's with our eyes. Jesus did not talk about sex much. Maybe there's a word for that for us today. But when He did talk about sex, He emphasized the eyes. You remember? You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman lustfully, looks, eyes. Where is the truth in that for us today? How might that deepen us as the people of God today? What we do with our eyes, the way we see people, is the first act of sex. When we objectify people with our eyes, we're a short step from abusing them with our lives. Our lives follow our eyes. Where sex causes people to say something with their bodies they are unwilling to say with the rest of their lives, it is not of God. Young people, do not say with your bodies something you're not willing to say with the totality of your life. And in this way, our sex ethic has so much more to do with our baptism than our bedrooms. Okay? Where sex elevates one person above another, rather than being an interplay of equals, it is not of God. Where women of character sit in shame because of the sins of men in power, it is not of God. And when the man is protected because he's our man, that also is not of God. And brothers and sisters, if you just think I'm talking about politics today, listen deeper. Listen deeper. This happens outside of this country. This happens in the church. It happens with both parties. And it's alive and well nearly everywhere we turn in our world today. Listen in the depths. Where sex is forced or coerced in any way, it is not of God. And so long as Tamar's tears go unnoticed and her weeping goes unheard, it is not of God. Can I say it more clearly? The church is the place where victims find comfort, acceptance, and healing. The church is the place where Tamar finds a friend, but it's also the place where Amnon finds accountability, because you can't have one without the other. It's also the place where perpetrators find redemption. But that redemption is on the other side of confession and repentance, not the easy side of confession and repentance. This is the time, brothers and sisters, for the church to stand up and say yes, yes, to a sex ethic that sees sex as a gift from God and that builds people up, and no to all the ways that gift is abused and misused in this world that destroys people's lives. We call this room a sanctuary, a holy place, a safe place. In a world where sex is hurting people, this must be a safe place. In a world where LGBTQ people are vulnerable and ostracized and oppressed, this must be a safe place. In a world where women all too often bear the shame of the sins of men, this must be a safe place. And in a world where the Amnons are typically protected because the Tamars are typically ignored and the one has everything to do with the other, this must be a safe place. Brothers and sisters, there's trouble in the king's house, but there is peace. Peace in God's house, to the extent that it is God's house. I began this day by telling you I'd rather talk about faith or hope or love than sex. But what if the day came where talking about sex was talking about faith and hope and love? Because it grew out of the same thing. What if the way we have sex or don't points to God, like everything else in our lives points to God? On that day, this will be a sanctuary. On that day, we would really be the church. And on that day, God's house might have something to say that is so beautiful and so true and so powerful that the king's house would have to listen, and everyone who stood between them. May it be so. Amen.